Okay, over to you, Joe.
Cool. Thanks, Frank. I'm going to share my screen here. Right. Can everybody see that? Yep. Okay, great.
Yes.
So I just want to first start off, just thank Dr. Frank Nugent for the opportunity to speak to everybody this evening. Really excited about having the next hour and a half to chat with you all on some topics that I'm particularly interested in a space that I've worked in for the last several years. So it's always great to reconnect with the faculty at UL. Very proud UL alum. So I'll just briefly just give you a little bit of an introduction of myself. So I'm currently a third-year PhD student at the University of Kansas, being co-supervised by Dr. Andrew Fry and Dr. Kate Ackerman. In the past, I worked for a community hospital in Lawrence, Kansas. So that was from 2017 to 2020. And during that time overlapped, I was a head strength and conditioning coach for the Portuguese Rowing Federation. And that was from 2018 to the end of the Tokyo Olympic cycle. And then in 2021, I went back to school. Took a year and went over to Ireland and completed the Master of Science in Sports Performance at the University of Limerick. And very grateful for that opportunity for the RPL, Recognized Prior Learning Admission Pathway, that allowed me to apply based on practical experience. So I've taken a pretty non-traditional route in strength and conditioning and coaching. Actually, my undergraduate degree was in business, and I started off in marketing. So I was able to apply and get admitted, and owe a great deal to Frank and the rest of the faculty in PES for kind of supporting me and lighting the fire to pursue the PhD. And then in the last couple of years, beginning in 2023 and in 2024, I've assisted at the U.S. Rowing High Altitude Training Camps in Colorado Springs. So it's a 3-week high altitude camp with all the senior team athletes. And in addition to that, I've been providing strength and conditioning support for the U.S. Rowing para rowers since November of 2023. So first question that I got from the audience was around concurrent training. So during the off season, rowers generally train indoors during the weekdays and on the water at the weekend. This usually consists of a mix of ergometer training or steady state on the water, and then strength training in the gym, which could involve heavy weights a couple of times a week. So the question's kind of centered around the conflicting neuromuscular adaptations between endurance and strength training. And so what I wanted to kind of share with you is actually, this is around the what they call the interference effect, right? So you have these competing adaptations that are trying to take place right around the same time, and your body's sort of sending disruptive or different signals at the same time. And this originally came about from a study that started in 1980 by Robert Hickson. And he was doing his postdoc work, and he was out on a run with his supervisor. And he had remarked to his supervisor that he noticed that he was starting to have decline or not as much improvement in his strength and conditioning training sessions when he started picking up the endurance running or going on runs with the supervisor. So this prompted him to look into this and kind of explore this further. So what he did in this study was he had 3 groups. There was a strength group, an endurance group, and a strength and endurance group. And the study was over, if I'm remembering correctly, 10-week period. And so they looked at a host of different variables, body weight, thigh circumference, percentage of body fat, as well as VO2 max. And then they also looked at 1RM squat performance. And so some of the interesting things you can see from the results here is that the endurance group had a drop in body weight. So really staying pretty lean. There was an increase in body weight with the strength group. There was a little bit of a decrease in the strength and endurance group. But the thing that's really interesting is when you look at thigh girth, they actually had hypertrophy. So their quadricep muscle group or hamstring muscle groups included, all of that got bigger, but their body weight went down. So to me, what that kind of indicates is that we were able to successfully put on some mass, but reduce the overall weight, which for rowers in particular is pretty valuable, right? You need to be able to produce a high amount of power across 2,000 meters. So being able to do that or increase muscle cross-sectional area, which would then potentially put you in a place to increase muscle force production, is a good spot to be in. And also you saw comparable decreases in body fat percentage. So the interesting thing is when he started to notice actually the declines in strength in the strength and endurance group, it didn't really occur until it was right around like the 7th or 8th week here. That's when he started to see this kind of drop off between the strength training group that did exclusively strength training work. So, and then you saw also they looked at VO2 max in the cycling work. And there was a little bit of a gap between the endurance group and the strength and endurance group. Again, right around that same time period. So I think it's just important to note, like historically, we want to make sure we go back into the literature and really get context and understand where these things are coming from, and then try to tie them back into the applied space in the current research. So you can see that improvements were still made in that strength and endurance group. They weren't as profound as the group that strength trained exclusively or the endurance group that just did endurance training exclusively. So I think the first thing to kind of take home from the interference effect is you still can make some improvements. There will be some blunting, but I don't think it's as dramatic as we've been led to believe, which kind of segues into some of the other variables that they looked at in terms of VO2. So you still saw improvements in all three groups across that 10-week period, which just kind of reinforces my earlier point. But I wanted to tie this into a more recent study that actually looked at the interference effect specifically in rowing athletes. And this was a study that was done in 2023 with a group of semi-professional Chilean rowers. And so they split the athletes into 5 groups. They had a control group that only did rowing and in the warm-up and the test, and then they had 4 resistance training groups: an upper body high fatigue group, an upper body low fatigue group, lower body high fatigue, and lower body low fatigue. And so the first kind of session was structured as a familiarization session where they took, height, weight, body mass, et cetera, all those types of things. And then they did a 12 RM assessment on the leg press and the bench pull. And so the high fatigue group for lower body and upper body did 4 sets to failure based upon that 12 RM value that they calculated in that first session. The low fatigue group only did 4 sets of 6 repetitions. And what they ended up finding was that both the high fatigue groups in the upper body and lower body had a significant decline in performance. So the way they structured this study was they immediately did those strength training sessions, and then they went and performed a 1,000-meter ergometer time trial. And they did this back to back. So there was like essentially moving from the gym right to the erg. There's no downtime really in between. Now, the lower body or the low fatigue group, there was no significant decline. You saw 0 to 0.2 in the upper body and 0.2 to 0.5 in the lower body. So almost a negligible difference in performance. And all of these values are compared against the control group that only did the rowing training. So that was kind of one of the questions I received. So I just wanted to kind of point this out to you. And then I'll talk a little bit about my applied experience regarding this question. So funny enough, the story I'm going to share is actually, we just wrapped up the spring semester in 2021 at UL. And I took a plane down to Portugal, and we had a training camp. It was about 8 to 10 weeks out from the Tokyo Olympics. And so we were down there, and in the gym session, it was us. So it was Portugal, Germany, Denmark. So several of the nations that had lightweight crews for that particular Olympiad. So we had a lot of us in the gym space sharing the space. And what was interesting was all of us across the board, given the constraints that we were all operating under, went immediately from the water to the gym to get that session in. So I think it's awesome that we can look at research and have these controlled type of environments. But, at the end of the day, athletes are getting done. They're at their second, maybe their third training session of the day. They want to get off the water, get that last session in, go and eat food and go to bed and get some rest. And some of that's athlete driven and some of that's also coaching driven. Like, hey, there's several other teams here at the facility. We have to share the gym space. This is the window of time that we have available. We're going to do it. So all those things collectively between some of my applied experience and some of the research that I just shared with you, I think it's perfectly suitable to try to execute concurrent training. The big thing out of that most recent study that we just shared that looked at specifically at rowing is do not go to failure. If you take athletes to failure, that is when you're going to have decrements or serious decline in rowing performance. But if you keep the effort in a moderate to hard area, they can still make really good strength improvements and it not negatively impact the rowing. So you can still get good bang for your buck in terms of time. Okay, second question is around training and overtraining. And how can you tell if you are overtraining? Is there an ideal volume of training different for male or female rowers? So historically, rowing across the board, whether you're looking at junior, university, elite, etc., historically a sport with very high training volumes. International level junior rowers are somewhere around 13 to 14 hours, and elite rowers are 20 plus. Some are in the 25 to 30 hour range, depending on the country and the training program. So this slide looks at actually kind of seminal study by Hans Selye, and this is where we get that general adaptation syndrome. So this is taken from his published work, a screenshot of this. And so what we have to remember, again, context is when we go to do a training session, we impart training, we're giving the body some type of stimulus. And it is during that session that we're actually breaking the body down. And that's what you can see in that shock, counter shock phase. And there's this potential decline. So you see this dip in performance here. And then if given adequate rest, the athlete's going to supercompensate and their base level of fitness is going to continue to go up. All right. And this is where we kind of get that that idea of general adaptation syndrome. So this is just kind of a simplified graphic that I've developed based off of a text looking at monitoring and preventing of overreaching and overtraining in endurance athletes. And so we're always striving to kind of hit that sweet spot between providing enough stimulus, whether that's volume or intensity, and adequate rest and recovery to get the outcomes, the adaptations that we want, right? Because availability is going to precede ability. And so when we look at training, or the context of training, there's 4 stages to it. That initial slide that I showed you with Hans Sellier's work is kind of looking at just a normal situation where you have training sessions, you're given adequate rest, and you can recover. But when we start to talk about overtraining or overtraining syndrome, that's when you have to kind of really look at it from a top level view, because there's many different criteria and steps along the way before you reach an overtraining syndrome. So functional overreaching can actually be an intentional training strategy that coaches may try to do, whether that's in a camp situation or potentially before a championship race or regatta. And the idea is that you're going to add in quite a bit of intensity and really, put the athlete in a situation where it's going to take them several days to recover. But the upside of that is, if given the appropriate amount of recovery, they're going to have a very pronounced rebound and really benefit from that stimulus, right? So if you do something like that and done correctly, the amount of recovery is going to be generally in the days range, 7 to 10 days, potentially longer, depending on how long and how intense that's all been. And there's a temporary, key word is here, temporary performance decline. Okay. Then when you kind of move over into non-functional overreaching, this is when the performance decline now shifts into the multiple weeks to months range, right? You see a stagnation or a complete decrease or regression in performance. And then finally, you move into overtraining syndrome, where it takes months, potentially even years for athletes to recover because they've been given so much either volume or intensity that their body can't cope with it. Now, overtraining syndrome can only be arrived at. It's a diagnosis that has to, one, be done by a clinician. So similar to REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. So it has to be arrived at by a clinician. And the only kind of universal agreed upon criteria is a decrement in performance for a prolonged period of time. There are other things, whether it's around anxiety, stress, disturbances in sleep, mood swings. So you can start to have some biopsychosocial disturbances. You could have potentially upper respiratory tract infections, illness or sickness. So all those things can kind of cascade or come around a non-functional overreaching or overtraining syndrome state. But you only arrive at the overtraining syndrome through going through this sort of checklist of all these different items and excluding one by one, very similar to REDS. You have to check off the list, okay, we've done blood work or we've done this, and this is not the cause, this is not the cause. So it's actually quite difficult to do that because, one, it's time and resource intensive. But some of the hallmark, the universal agreed upon tenet of this is that there is a clear decline in performance for a sustained period of time. Okay. So I just wanted to highlight this for several reasons. So this is a consensus statement that was published in 2013 through the American College of Sports Medicine. My supervisor was one of the co-authors on it, but what I really wanted to point out to you all was that the two final authors are Jürgen Steinacker and Axel Erhausen. So Jürgen Steinacker is the medical chair of World Rowing, and Erhausen's actually done, in the mid to late 90s, he did some pretty extensive research in rowing. And him and Steinacker have worked pretty closely together. And they actually did a training study that looked at a training camp situation in junior male rowers. And they had 40% of those athletes ended up contracting an upper respiratory tract infection after that camp. So it was a study that was based around a training camp situation where they knew going into it that the coaching staff was going to really ramp up the amount of intensity and stimulus this group of athletes was going to receive. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend taking a look at this consensus statement and some of Jürgen and Axel's work in the early to mid 1990s. So those are the two questions I put together. I'm happy to expand upon anything, and then also open up the floor for questions that you may have.
Have you got any questions, guys? We've lots of rowing people on the call here. Myself and Joe have a rowing background as well, so no question is a bad question. And I know for a lot of people it's that time of year as well. It's pre-season, and we're kind of trying to map out the year and wondering, are we going to approach it different than we did last year? So is there any questions that come to mind? I've got a list of them here for Joe, so I do, but I don't want to give priority to all our attendees today. Any questions that come to mind at all, guys?
Sorry, can you hear me,
Mackie? Yeah, I can hear you there, Mackie. Fire ahead.
Yeah,
I knew you'd have a question.
Concurrent training. You were saying that without doing, what it seemed to me was without doing a lot of heavyweight training. In other words, you wouldn't interfere with your endurance. But if we're looking to build strength, we'd be looking, to lift heavy weights. So were you saying in a roundabout way that you shouldn't be lifting very heavy weights?
So that second study that I cited, the one that specifically looked at rowers, their kind of takeaway from that was to control the effort that the athletes gave in that training session when they did the strength training part in particular. So probably the best way to do that is one, as you indicated, with load, but the second one is to use rate of perceived exertion. So either the Borg 6 to 20 scale or the simplified CR10 0 to 10 scale. So it does take a little bit of explanation and education around understanding the scale and how to properly allocate your effort levels in relation to where the scale falls. But the way that I would try to help prescribe that is, if you're writing up your training program, one, I totally acknowledge what you're saying in terms of building strength and maximal force production, which is what we want in rowing and in the rowing stroke, right, is to be able to improve power capabilities across 2,000 meters. But we also don't want to detract from the rowing training session, and we're trying to balance all this out with constraints around time, right? So the loads they used in that study were based off of a 12 RM, which by in and of itself is probably not very heavy. So I think the best thing to do is probably to monitor it through, like I said, RPE, and keep the reps per set on the lower side. still get some stimulus in there with heavier loads, but do not take the athletes to failure. So that would kind of be the first piece. And then the other part of it is, I think what's helpful from a training program design standpoint is you have your rowing training session and your S&C session. However those are structured, whether it's looking at kilometers or minutes, I think it's a really good practice that I started to do, and working with the University of Kansas women's rowing team, is having the coaches put a prescribed RPE for that session. So what is their intended RPE that they want the athletes to try to be at? And then what you do afterwards is that you have the athletes actually rank it. And so you'll get really good, clear feedback. Well, we were doing a threshold type session of 2x6K. We think that should be around an 8. Well, the athlete ranked it at a 9 or a 10. So we're off a little bit there. So that's really good subjective feedback that you can get from them on their perception of how difficult it may be. Is that helpful, Mackie?
Yes and no. It's sort of, judge for yourself, or that's the way I perceive it. So do we do a light steady state session and then do a heavyweight session? Again, heavyweights to me is generally on not to failure, but just below failure, to get the right adaptation for heavyweights. So do we just do heavyweights and leave it at that on that particular day, and then not do endurance training till the next day, something like that?
Yeah. So I mean, so I guess let's back up. I guess the first question is, do you have time or availability in your program to structure it in a way where you can space out 2 sessions, maybe 4 to 6 hours in a day? So they can do an S&C session, doesn't matter, morning or afternoon, and rowing, and there's a gap of time that can separate them. Would that be yes?
Yes. I mean, obviously a row in the morning.
So if you can do that, then that's fine. You can go heavy. When I was talking specifically for probably the last 30 minutes or so concurrent, I was specifically referring to back-to-back. It's one elongated session over a 90 minute to 120 minute block, where I'm working with junior or university athletes or in a camp situation, and this is our window of time and we've got to get it all in. Doesn't sound like that's your particular situation. So
it can be both, but I mean,
it can be, yeah.
Whatever would give me the best results, and with the people, or whatever suits them as a training group.
Yeah. So my preference historically has been, when I do heavy S&C work, is to stack it on the same day that I'm doing intensity work. And the reason is part of the original question that you sent me is around the neuromuscular. So even if you're separating it from 4 to 6 hours, I want to stack all that neuromuscular stress on one day, versus I'm doing a heavy strength training session and then I'm rowing 20 to 30K my second session of the day or whatever. And then the next day I'm doing a high intensity or some type of hard rowing session, but no weights. So to me, that's kind of, I'm spreading the intensity moderate to hard each day. Whereas I'd rather have very clear, this day is going to be a low intensity volume rowing day or a cross training day with, time on the bike or time in the single and on the erg. And the other day I'm doing my S&C work and I'm doing some intensity work in rowing. Is that a little clearer?
Yes, more food for thought.
Okay.
Fire ahead there, Pat.
Hey, Frankie. How are you, Joe? Equally then, would you protect the athlete on endurance weights from failure also?
Could you be a little more specific?
Say
Like,
if
are
we're
you talking
going,
about going to failure or just like high repetition sets?
no, just failing by either repetition or by a little bit too much weight. Is there a danger in failure for the endurance weights, or is it less dangerous for an athlete to go into that zone?
Yeah, I think
weights.
so I think across the board, whether you have a heavy load or a lighter load, if you're going to failure, it's not going to get positive results. There was a second study that I didn't include in the slide deck. It was by Guardo. I'm going to mispronounce his last name. Guardo Gavin, I think. But he did a similar training study, structured similar, where they had groups that were going to failure and then other groups that were not going to failure. And they looked at power at 4 millimoles of lactate, a 20-minute test, and then like a peak wattage tests. And the not to failure group outperformed the failure group. So yeah, there's no upside to taking athletes to failure if you're going to get ready to do a training session either later in the day or right after.
Okay, any other questions, guys? Another about 8 or 9 minutes with Joe before we hit the hour mark.
Oh, Ian. Hey, Ian.
Joe, thanks very much. I want to probe a little bit on the conversation I had with Frank today about tapering to
Sure.
From a heavy load of training on a program to maybe a competition that is a major competition of some sort in terms of intensity and overall load, and how you typically manage that in rowing, because we had a conversation about running into marathon tapering.
Yeah.
Just any general thoughts on competition preparation and loading?
Yeah. That's a great question. So generally speaking, so first and foremost, the way that I'll kind of operate is when I'm working with a rowing coach, they'll write the rowing training program first, because the priority is always rowing, right? That's what we're training, that's what we're racing for. And then from there, I will build the S&C program around that to support and complement it. But the other part of it that's helpful is part of your question is that that allows me to sort of look at how things are progressing and match up or build into a taper. So generally, if we're working towards a championship or a type level race, I will start to reduce or drop the volume about 3 to 4 weeks out, but I will maintain the intensity. So generally by that final week, they'll still be touching heavy loads in that last week. I would say probably 72 hours out, unless there's travel or they're unable to get the resources they need if they're traveling to a regatta. But the reps will come down considerably. I'll keep the intensity up somewhere in the 85 to 90% 1 RM range, so pretty high. But by the end, they're doing 2 sets of 2 or 2 sets of 3, and they were up around maybe 3 to 4 sets of 5 repetitions 4 weeks back. Yeah, did that answer your question, sir?
I was in the time period of the 3 to 4 weeks is good to hear.
Yeah.
You're reducing that period. Thank you.
Yeah, winding it down slowly. Is I'm trying to find it. I can, if I can't find it right now, I'll send it afterwards. Actually, one of the presentations I gave a few years ago for US Rowing was actually around exactly that, was tapering. So I have a slide deck that I did a couple of years ago. I can send over if you want.
Super, appreciate that. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Have you any other questions, guys? Tricia, I think you had your hand up there. And then Mark. Tricia, do you want to jump on there?
Yeah, it's just in relation to training and looking at women's masters. Obviously an older group in their 50s. I'm sure the research that you were talking about were probably men and probably younger, and they have a sort of a different kind of training regime. So I'm just wondering about women, older women in sport, especially in rowing. Have you any advice on strengthening and conditioning?
Yeah. So first of all, yes. So all the studies that I mentioned involve male participants. 100% correct. And that's actually something my entire PhD dissertation is with a 100% university women's rowing team. So that's something I'm actually actively trying to kind of help be some of that change, is do more sports performance research with female athletes, female rowers in particular, because it is, as you noted, a very underserved population and part of the sports performance literature. So in terms of like strength training or advice for like female masters athletes, it's probably even more important for a female masters athlete than a male athlete. Across the board, everybody's dealing with sarcopenia, so loss of lean muscle mass as we age. But women also have osteoporosis, and then potentially going into perimenopause or menopause. So you have this sort of milieu of a cascade of different, hormonal changes happening across, a varying time frame for each individual. So doing quality strength training is going to be really important to, one, maintain or potentially increase lean tissue mass as you get older, as well as bone density. And then two, also to maintain and improve your performance. There was a study that we went over last fall two years ago in skeletal muscle physiology, and it was in sprinters, master sprinters. The thing that was particularly interesting about this was these were athletes all the way up into their 60s. They continued to do some type of high intensity work where you knew they were going to start recruiting more of those type 2 fibers, those fast twitch muscle fibers, versus like a controlled population. The interesting part was everybody had a decline, but the magnitude of decline in those masters athletes who continued to do like high intensity sprinting type of work and strength training was significantly less than the control population or athletes that just did like endurance work. So it is, carve out time for it. I would say, if you're younger, maybe 2 sessions a week. You get into the masters age groups 3 times a week. Super important. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, Mark, fire away there.
Thanks, Frank. Hi, Joe. Good to see you again.
You
Thanks
too.
for accepting the invite to talk.
Yeah.
Joe, my question really is around, I suppose, trying to find a balance between functional overreaching into non-functional overreaching. Are there particular training load metrics that you lean on?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, so I mean, some of that's actually right at kind of the heart of the dissertation. So I think the crossroads here, right, is I come back to is, one, we want to get quality information, but we need to be consciously aware of not placing excess of burden on the athletes, right? So the more that I've worked with the University Women's Rowing team, right, compliance and frequency to me becomes much more important than like a bunch of different tests. Because if the data becomes strengthened if I'm getting them to do it on a regular basis. So RPE is the big one that we try to look at, both for on water and land-based sessions, S&C and the erg. And then the other one that I'm working on is looking at like a sub-maximal, like 5-minute heart rate recovery test. This is not something I've developed. I came across it helping out with some of the high altitude camps with U.S. rowing. And so what the high performance officer has the senior team athletes do is they do 5 minutes, no warm up, sit down in the air at 5 minutes at 50% approximately of their 2K wattage. At the end of the 5 minutes, they record their heart rate, and then they sit passively for 2 minutes and they record their heart rate recovery at 60 seconds and then heart rate recovery at 120 seconds. So there was, he kind of adapted this. There's 2 studies that come to mind. One was by Martin Bouchait that did something with soccer players, and they did like a 5-minute warm up. The other one was the Lambert and Lambert sub-maximal cycling test. But that protocol is completely different. That was 17 minutes, 5 minutes at 60% heart rate, 5 at 80, 5 at 90, and then 2 minutes passive recovery. The issue with that is nobody's going to implement that before a training session. The 5-minute test, quick and dirty, you get the information you need. And then what you can do is, what you start to look at is the heart rate recovery score and their heart rate at the end of the 5 minutes. So you can kind of create like little categories of like top 10% and bottom 10%, meaning top 10%, my heart rate hits 150 beats at the end of the 5 minutes. It drops to 150 beat difference. So that's like my top 10%. My bottom 10%, we just had like a really hard week. It only drops down to like 120. So now I only had like a 30 beat decrease, right? So it's pretty clear to see. Then the other one that they'll do is actually watts over the heart rate. So then you're looking at essentially, if we're holding the wattage for the 5 minutes at a constant, it doesn't change, but the heart rate changes based on wherever they are in the training program. Now is the cost of actually producing the same amount of power become higher. Does that make sense? So I'm happy to like have a separate call with you and Frank if you guys want to go over that a little bit more. But that's one that I'm working to potentially be a chapter in the dissertation. But other tests outside of those, the other one that I'm exploring is looking at counter movement jump on force plates. So we've got a manuscript right now, an internal review, and we did a study at the U.S. Rowing Indoor Championships. So it was a mix of university, general population, masters, male, female, junior, et cetera, across the board. So we just had them do 3 counter movement jumps on ball force decks, and then all their ergometer data was publicly available. And so I wanted to look at the counter movement jump variables specifically around force and power, and what is the variable? I'm forgetting right now. Frank, help me. What's the area under the force curve? Impulse. That's it. So what we found was, I thought this was really interesting. The variable that had the strongest relationship to 2,000 meter ergometer performance was positive takeoff impulse. So everything above body weight that they could produce during that portion, right? So there's something there in the rowing athlete where when we look at the rowing stroke from just either on the erg or on the water, we want to increase the amount of force production, but we want to either increase also the distance or the time they're producing that force to make for a long rowing stroke. Well, somehow that's showing up in how they perform a counter movement jump. So maybe the force that they're producing isn't relatively that high compared to other athletic groups, but they're doing it over a longer period of time, right? So to me, it's really kind of interesting. You're seeing a completely different athletic movement. The variable that comes up is impulse. So the follow-up to that is going to be to see if some of those variables around force, but particularly impulse, could be a marker for neuromuscular status. So that's going to be the follow-up to that. I don't know yet is the answer for that one.
I don't know on the training load side here, Joe. We're still working it out, I think, to be honest. Limb length is the only thing that I think might factor into the counter movement jump.
Yeah,
it might be one of those factors that relates to why you're seeing bigger impulse. But yeah. Thanks a lot, Joe.
No, and just one other thing, Mark. So the other thing is, you planted this in my seed in one of our conversations that we had during my year at UL. So I bought. Highly recommend everybody get this book. Mark will recognize that name, McGuigan. So McGuigan was Trent Lawton's supervisor. Trent Lawton did his PhD with Rowing New Zealand. It was all on strength and conditioning. McGuigan was a supervisor. So some of the other metrics I'm looking at is just very simple stuff. None of this is new, but the same point I made earlier about prescription for RPE, like have the coach prescribe RPE. So we're doing that with the training program with University of Kansas Women's Rowing, but also now this year we're looking at prescribed training stress and training monotony. And then what I want is, as long as the athletes are consistent about logging their RPE, I can then look at prescription versus individual athlete and where does it stack up. Does that make sense? So nothing new. I think it's just looking at the simple stuff and getting it. But I keep coming back to RPE because it's easy, it's quick. Frequency, I can get it every day or across multiple training sessions in a day.
Okay, guys, we're a little bit over the hour now, so I think we'll wrap things up. Thanks a lot for coming tonight, and thanks to Joe for a really detailed discussion.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.